we don't expand our imagination.
Justification for being what you are.
Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson. Once again, officials in Washington are having an unplanned, urgent conversation about Afghanistan. Last night, the whistleblower site Wikileaks released over 90,000 reports spanning two administrations from 2004 to 2009 that paints a grim picture of the war in Afghanistan. Joining me now to discuss all of this are CBS News national security correspondent David Martin and national security analyst Juan Zarate. David, I just want to start with you, a bit of context. How big a deal is this leak?
Well, the big deal here is, at least as far as the military concerned, is not so much the substance of the leaks as the scope of the leak. 90,000 documents over a 6-year period. I mean, that's just a wholesale compromise of documents that were officially, for the most part, classified secret. Now, the reality is that in the U.S. government, secret is not a very high classification, and that means that thousands and thousands of people have access to these documents. But still, they've come out in this absolute hemorrhage of documents, and I think that is the number one concern. Like the rest of us, the U.S. government hasn't had time to read all 90,000 documents since they were posted on the web just last night. So there's still a damage assessment going on to see if any real secrets were compromised, or if this is basically reporting that was classified at the time, but now the passage of time has made it not so sensitive.
I know you haven't read the 90,000 reports, since no human could in the span of time, but what's your assessment of, in terms of the substance, how different this picture is from what we knew, or is it just that it's all in one place in terms of what the situation was like in Afghanistan during that period?
Well, we've been losing in Afghanistan for some number of years now. You can pick the year when the tide turned, but we've been losing in Afghanistan for perhaps 3 or 4 years. So the reasons we've been losing are civilian casualties, a shortage of our forces, and corruption within the Afghan government. And all of that is the subject of these cables. These are exactly the kinds of reports that you hear when you sit in on a commander's update in Afghanistan. They go by a mile a minute, and it's only the big ones that stick out. But this is the nitty-gritty of tactical operations in a war. As the head of Wikileaks said, and I think he said it just right, it's one damn thing after another. But it does not really change your overall perception of the war. The United States is in trouble. We know why it's in trouble, and here's some more examples of why we're in trouble.
Juan, give me your perspective on how this plays out in the world, what it tells us and how it affects our relations with these other countries.
Well, first, John, it's interesting that 2 of the 3 publications that had access to these documents are in Europe. And so what you have is not just the debate in Washington about where we're headed in Afghanistan, whether or not we have the right strategy, whether or not we can even win, given the context of the challenges that we face, as David mentioned. But also that debate is happening in Europe. That debate is happening in the UK, which is considering when they're going to withdraw their troops. It's happening in Germany. Der Spiegel got a copy of these documents as well. What role can the Germans play in northern Afghanistan, which is growing more and more violent over time? And so in Europe, you're seeing this debate unfold. In addition, I think quite devastatingly, you have no doubt discussions now in Kabul and Islamabad, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where there have been questions as to how much these partners of ours, the Afghan authorities and the Pakistan authorities, can rely on the U.S. as trusted long-term partners. You've seen the Obama administration try desperately to convey that message. Secretary Clinton was just out in the region conveying precisely that message. Chairman Mullen was just out there in Islamabad yesterday. And so in some ways, though, suspicions of Pakistani complicity with the Haqqani network and other elements of the Taliban network in Afghanistan have been known and talked about, seeing it in print, seeing it in secret reports, all it does is aggravate the sense of mistrust between parties. And I think we're going to see ripple effects of these leaks over time, unfortunately.
In the Bush administration, there was a similar leak with Stephen Hadley's memo that he wrote to the president about Nouri al-Maliki and in Iraq. And there was a pushback the president had to make to sort of counterbalance this private guidance he was getting. And it feels like there's a possible similar situation here that you're hinting at, which is this description of Karzai as being a totally unstable partner. Does President Obama, do all officials now, because of this leak, have to come out and kind of double down on Karzai, which, when paired with what's in the actual behind-the-scenes documents, makes them look kind of out of touch? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I think there's damage control across the board here. There's a damage assessment, which is the official assessment of, what damage is coming out of the actual documents, sources, methods, that kind of thing. Military is doing that now. But there's a political and diplomatic damage assessment that has to be undertaken as well. And no doubt the Obama administration now, through the State Department and others, will be trying to allay fears in capitals around the world that we are not a trustful ally, that A, we can keep secrets, that our documents that may be shared from around the world won't appear on the internet, but secondly, and more importantly, that we are good long-term partners. The one thing that I would say, John, that's a little bit different than some of the past leaks that we've had, these are leaks of raw frontline reports. It's not a leak of a grand memo or a grand program. And so in some ways, this is an unvarnished view, perhaps a little bit out of context, but an unvarnished view of what's happening on the front lines, which is a little bit different.
David, they're going through damage assessment at the Pentagon. How long will such a thing take, and how thorough is that? I mean, how many people could be potential leakers of this information?
Well, the damage review is going to take days, if not weeks, according to one Pentagon official, just because of the sheer volume and the collation and the cross-referencing that has to be done. Because remember now, it's not like we're getting a one-time snapshot here. These documents are going to be on the web for researchers to work on from here on, and so there's going to be a lot of information to be mined from these. So you really, to get at the damage assessment, you have to figure out what could be compromised over time as these things are researched. And as for suspects, there's of course the one case of the Army private who is in custody in Kuwait right now and charged with leaking that video of the Apache helicopter assault on what turned out to be civilians in downtown Baghdad. These documents, of course, are all about Afghanistan, but these communications hubs work in ways where he obviously would be a person of interest, you could say, without slandering him in any way, I think, as to how these documents got out.
David, how do you do business going forward if you're trying to give unvarnished reports and you think, well, maybe this will all kind of come out someday? Or is that something that's not really one of the aftershocks of this?
Well, the reports that I've read so far are, just these basically what you would call sit-reps, situation reports. Such and such happened in such and such a place at such and such a time. And having that suddenly come out, I think has no repercussions really for the person who wrote them or for anybody else. So in terms of factual reporting about what's going on the ground in Afghanistan, I'm not sure it's going to have much impact. I mean, I think if I were writing a secret memo in which I were expressing opinions about President Karzai or one of my own commanders, I think I'd probably think twice about putting all that on paper.
Juan, when you were in the administration, you had to deal with a little bit of this. What's it like when you're kind of in the middle of trying to do something and then you read about it in the paper by surprise the next day?
Well, it's a challenge because certainly the folks in government who are either conveying facts in secret documents or trying to run a secret program want it to remain secret because they believe that it's effective, that you need that secrecy to have unvarnished dialogue, and that there's potentially damage if something becomes known publicly. I think what people who tend to leak fail to recognize is, A, they don't necessarily have a full breadth of knowledge to understand what damage this will actually do. And secondly, I think there's a lack of an appreciation that there is an ongoing war here, that you know, secrets do matter and lives could be on the line. And sometimes I think there's a degree of frustration for those who are executing the war, who are in the middle of these programs, for the lack of appreciation for the value of keeping some of these secrets in order to save lives. I think, you know, one of the issues, to your question to David, with respect to mistrust, I think there is going to be a ripple effect here to a certain extent with the information sharing within theater. We've worked very hard, the U.S. government's worked very hard to share more and more intelligence and information between U.S. government agencies and with foreign partners. And the fact that you have these documents now appearing on the internet, documents that not only are sit reps, but also information about what we know about what's happening on the Pakistan side of the border, who's meeting with the Taliban commanders or not, et cetera, that has a chilling effect. And so there are all sorts of ramifications that I think those who leak tend not to worry about because they're not in positions of responsibility.
Any upside to the chilling effect, which is to say, does Pakistan now know that we know more about what they're up to than they might think we otherwise did?
Potentially. I mean, you could argue that it adds to the debate and the pressure on Pakistan to do more in Western Pakistan, but you know, I would say that pressure is probably better placed in private from folks like Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton.
David, last question on does this get in the way of what General Petraeus is doing? One of the things the White House has said is both this does threaten ongoing operations, but they've also said, look, this is a picture of Afghanistan before the president's review. Things have changed. We're on a new course here. Assess the sort of how this affects what General Petraeus is doing in his new role there.
Well, he has 30,000 more troops that weren't in Afghanistan at the time all of these cables were written. So that's one big difference. And of course, starting with General McChrystal, there's been a big attempt to hold down the number of civilian casualties caused by airstrikes and nighttime commando raids. So to a certain extent, the Obama administration can argue that the cables, that was then, this is now the new strategy with Petraeus. But the one factor that seems to be a constant here is the corruption and inefficiency of the Afghan government. I mean, some of these cables, listening to Afghan provincial councils talk about how corrupt the central government is, and that the government is much worse than the Taliban when it comes to corruption. That is the real linchpin to this whole American effort in Afghanistan. And I don't think 30,000 troops is necessarily going to be the way to solve that.
Actually, one other last question, which is the keeping the American people in the dark is one of the things you hear attached to this number of reports being released. You know, you said this is basically just the day after day by day. It's a different kind of information in tonnage, but not necessarily in what's inside of it. Give me your assessment on the sort of notion of keeping Americans in the dark. Is there some huge secret in here that Americans have not been let in on?
I don't think so, except that how ugly war is. We tend to focus on the large civilian casualty episodes. But I remember sitting in one briefing in Afghanistan where a unit was testing out its artillery piece after having done maintenance on it. So it test fired around and it killed a farmer. Now that is a tragedy, but did I run out and report that? No, because it's frankly, as tragic as it is, it's just not a story of national interest. All of that is in here. All those day by day, kids getting hit by cars, a car not slowing down when it comes up to a checkpoint. That kind of day by day stuff, unless somebody is there with a camera to witness it, tends not to get reported. Now we're seeing it all in black and white.
Okay, David Martin, thanks very much. Juan Zarate, thank you very much. Thanks all of you for watching Washington Unplugged. Join us here each day at 12:30 on CBSNews.com. I'm John Dickerson. Have a great day.
If we don't expand